November 2nd, 1959, 2:47 p.m. Woodlawn Cemetery, the Bronx. Bumpy Johnson visited his father's grave on the same day every year, November 2nd, the anniversary of his father's death in 1926. 33 years of coming to this same plot, standing in silence for 10 minutes, then leaving. It was the one ritual Bumpy kept completely private. No bodyguards, no associates. Just him, a small bouquet of white carnations, and the memory of a man who'd worked himself to death in a Charleston cotton mill so his son could have a better life. Bumpy's black Cadillac pulled through the cemetery gates at 2:47 p.m., following the familiar path towards Section 14, Plot 127. He saw them from 100 yards away. 4 cars, maybe 15 men, standing in a semicircle around his father's grave. Bumpy pulled his car to a stop 30 feet away and got out slowly. The men didn't move, just stood there, arms crossed, watching him approach. Bumpy recognized the setup immediately. This wasn't random, this was planned. This was a message. He walked forward until he was 10 feet from the nearest man, a thick-shouldered enforcer with a scar running down his left cheek. "This section's closed today," the scarred man said. Bumpy didn't respond, just looked past him to his father's grave, visible between 2 of the standing men. "You hear me?" the scarred man asked. "I said this section's closed." "I heard you. Move." "Can't do that. Boss says nobody comes through here today. Cemetery maintenance. You'll have to come back another time." Bumpy's eyes moved from the scarred man to the others. 15 men, all of them armed, judging by the way their jackets hung. All of them positioned deliberately to block access to one specific grave, his father's grave. "Who's your boss?" "Anthony Gallo. You know him?" Bumpy knew him. Anthony Mad Dog Gallo ran a crew out of Brooklyn, mid-level operation, ambitious but not particularly smart. They'd been pushing into Harlem for the past 6 months, testing boundaries, seeing what they could get away with. Apparently, this was their latest test. "You sent Anthony here," Bumpy said, not a question. "That's right. He wanted to make sure you understood that things are changing, that your free pass is over." Bumpy was quiet for 10 seconds, still looking at his father's grave. Then he turned and walked back to his car. The 15 men watched him go, some of them smiling, thinking they'd just won something. Bumpy got in his Cadillac, started the engine, and drove out of Woodlawn Cemetery without looking back. November 2nd, 1959, 3:52 p.m. An hour and 5 minutes after leaving Woodlawn Cemetery, Bumpy Johnson returned. Alone. Same black Cadillac, same white carnations on the passenger seat. He pulled through the gates, followed the path to Section 14. The 4 cars were still there, but the 15 men were gone. Every single one of them.
Bumpy parked his car in the exact same spot as before, got out, walked to his father's grave without any obstruction. He knelt down, placed the white carnations against the headstone, and stayed there for exactly 10 minutes. Nobody interrupted. Nobody appeared. The cemetery was completely silent, except for the wind moving through the trees. When Bumpy finished, he stood up, walked back to his car, and drove away. He never spoke publicly about what happened in that hour and 5 minutes between his first visit and his second. But 3 days later, Anthony Mad Dog Gallo disappeared. November 2nd, 1959, 4:15 p.m. The scarred enforcer who'd told Bumpy the section was closed had been the first to notice something was wrong. He'd been standing with the other 14 men, smoking a cigarette, joking about how they just made Bumpy Johnson turn around and leave like a civilian who'd been told the park was closed. Then one of the younger guys said, "Hey, you hear that?" "Hear what?" "Nothing. That's the problem. Where's the traffic noise?" Woodlawn Cemetery sat near the intersection of Jerome Avenue and East 233rd Street. You could always hear traffic, cars, trucks, the L train passing overhead. But right now, There was nothing. Complete silence. "Something's wrong," another man said. That's when the scarred enforcer saw him. A man standing about 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a mausoleum, just standing there, watching. Then another man appeared, different direction, also watching. Then a third, then a fourth. "We need to leave," the scarred enforcer said quietly. "Right now." "What? Why?" "Because we're surrounded." The 15 men looked around and realized he was right. There were people positioned all around them, not moving, not approaching, just watching. And in that moment, every single one of Anthony Gallo's men understood they'd made a catastrophic mistake. They'd blocked Bumpy Johnson from visiting his father's grave, and now they were standing in a cemetery, surrounded by people they couldn't identify, with no clear path to their cars. "Move," the scarred enforcer said. "Slowly. Don't run. Just get to the cars." They moved as a group, trying to maintain formation, trying to look confident, but every man there was calculating the same thing. How fast could they draw their weapons? How many shooters were out there? What were their odds of making it to the vehicles? They reached the cars without incident. Engines started. Doors slammed. All 4 cars pulled out of Woodlawn Cemetery within 90 seconds, speeding towards the exit like they were being chased. Nobody chased them. But as they drove away, the scarred enforcer looked in his rearview mirror and saw something that made his blood run cold. A black Cadillac, Bumpy's Cadillac, pulling back into the cemetery, returning to finish what he'd come to do. November 2nd, 1959, 6:30 p.m. Anthony Mad Dog Gallo sat in his social club in Brooklyn, listening to his men explain what had happened at Woodlawn Cemetery.
"You left?" Anthony asked. "You had 15 guys and you left because you saw some people standing around?" "Boss, it wasn't just people. It was a setup. We were surrounded. If you'd stayed, you would have done what I told you to do, which was keep Bumpy Johnson away from that grave. Make him understand that we don't respect his schedules, his rituals, his sacred days." The scarred enforcer, whose name was Dominic, shook his head slowly. "Boss, with respect, I don't think this was the right move." "Why not?" "Because that wasn't about territory or money or power. That was personal. That was his father's grave, and we turned it into a statement. That's exactly what it was supposed to be, a statement that Bumpy Johnson doesn't get special treatment anymore, that his time is over." "Boss," Dominic said carefully, "Bumpy came back. After we left, he went right back to that grave and did what he came to do, like we were never there." Anthony went very still. "He came back?" "An hour later, by himself, and nobody stopped him." "Why didn't you go back? Why didn't you hold position?" Dominic didn't answer immediately, because the real answer was that every instinct he had, every survival mechanism built up over 20 years of working in this world, had told him to leave and not come back. Because we were outmatched, we just didn't know it until it was too late. Anthony stood up, paced to the window, stared out at the Brooklyn street. "He's not going to let this go," Dominic said. "We crossed a line. We need to fix this before—" "Before what?" Anthony snapped. "Before Bumpy Johnson gets mad? I don't care if he's mad. I wanted him mad. I wanted him to understand that the rules he thinks protect him don't apply anymore." "Boss, get out," Anthony said. "All of you. I need to think." Anthony and the other men left. Anthony stayed at the window trying to convince himself that blocking Bumpy from his father's grave had been a smart tactical move. He had 3 days to figure out he was wrong. November 3rd, 1959, Day 1. Anthony Gallo woke up to find his car missing. Not stolen, just gone. Parked on the street outside his apartment at midnight, vanished by 8 a.m. He called his crew. Nobody had seen it. Nobody had moved it. He called the police. They said they'd file a report, but didn't sound particularly interested. At 2 p.m., Anthony received a phone call. No name, no introduction, just a voice.
The car's at Woodland Cemetery, Section 14. You can pick it up any time. The line went dead. Anthony sent 2 of his men to retrieve it. They found the car parked exactly where Anthony had positioned his crew the day before, right next to Bumpy Johnson's father's grave. The keys were in the ignition. The car was undamaged.
But there was a white carnation on the driver's seat. November 4th, 1959, Day 2. Anthony's social club was broken into overnight. Nothing was stolen, nothing was vandalized, but someone had been inside. They knew because there was a photograph left on Anthony's desk, a photograph of Anthony taken from across the street, standing in the window of his apartment. The message was clear. We know where you are, we can reach you any time, and you won't see us coming. Anthony called Dominic. We need to find out who's doing this. Boss, we know who's doing this. I mean, we need to figure out how they're getting access, how they knew about the cemetery, how they got into the club, how they... Boss, Dominic interrupted. It's not about figuring out how. It's about understanding that Bumpy Johnson controls more of this city than we thought, and we made him use that control against us. So what do you want me to do? Apologize? Dominic was quiet for a moment. Yeah, actually, I think you should. I'm not apologizing for, then you're going to disappear, Dominic said bluntly, because that's what's coming. That's what always comes when people cross lines they shouldn't cross. First, the pressure, then the isolation, then the disappearance. You're being dramatic. Am I? How many people have crossed Bumpy Johnson over the years and just vanished? No bodies, no witnesses, no investigations, just gone. Anthony hung up on him. November 5th, 1959, Day 3. Anthony Mad Dog Gallo left his apartment at 7:30 a.m., same as always. He walked to the corner deli, bought a coffee and a newspaper, same as always. He walked back toward his apartment. He never arrived. Somewhere between the deli and his building, a distance of 2 blocks, Anthony Gallo disappeared. November 5th, 1959, 4 p.m. Dominic went to Anthony's apartment when his boss didn't show up for a noon meeting. The apartment was empty. Bed was made, coffee cup in the sink, newspaper on the table, open to the sports section. Anthony's car was parked on the street. His wallet was on the dresser. But Anthony was gone. Dominic called the rest of the crew together. Anyone seen Anthony? Nobody had. Anyone heard from him? Silence. We need to find him, one of the younger guys said. We're not going to find him, Dominic said quietly. What do you mean? I mean he's gone. Same way people have been going gone for 30 years in this city when they cross Bumpy Johnson. No body, no witnesses, no trace. Just gone. We should call the police. And tell them what? Dominic asked. That our boss, who runs an illegal gambling operation and extortion racket, disappeared after he blocked Bumpy Johnson from visiting his father's grave. You think they're going to investigate that? The room was silent. What do we do? Someone finally asked. We do nothing, Dominic said. We close down operations in Harlem. We pull back to Brooklyn. We don't talk about Anthony. We don't ask questions. And we learn the lesson that Anthony didn't live long enough to learn, which is that some things are sacred, and people who forget that don't get second chances. November 6th, 1959. The NYPD officially opened a missing persons case for Anthony Gallo. It was assigned to a detective named Morrison who'd been working organized crime cases for 15 years. Detective Morrison interviewed Anthony's crew. They told him Anthony had left his apartment in the morning and never came back. He interviewed neighbors. Nobody saw anything. He interviewed the deli owner. Anthony had bought coffee, seemed normal, left walking north toward his apartment. Morrison filed his report. Subject disappeared between 7:45 and 8 a.m. on November 5th. No witnesses, no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. Case remains open pending further developments.
The case was never officially closed, but no detective ever actively worked it after the first week, because everyone in the NYPD who worked organized crime knew the same thing Dominic knew. Anthony Gallo had crossed Bumpy Johnson, and people who did that had a way of disappearing. You couldn't prove it, you couldn't prosecute it, but you knew it. And if you were smart, you didn't ask too many questions. November 2nd, 1960, 1 year later. Bumpy Johnson pulled through the gates of Woodlawn Cemetery at 2:47 p.m., same as always. He drove to Section 14, Plot 127. He parked his car, took a bouquet of white carnations from the passenger seat, and walked to his father's grave. Nobody stopped him. Nobody approached him. He knelt down, placed the flowers, stayed for 10 minutes, and left. The same ritual he'd performed for 34 years. The same ritual that Anthony Gallo had tried to interrupt. And as Bumpy drove out of the cemetery, he thought about something his father had told him when he was a boy in Charleston, South Carolina. Son, there's 3 things a man protects no matter what: his name, his family, and the memory of those who came before him. You let people disrespect those things, you got nothing left worth protecting. Bumpy had protected all 3, and Anthony Gallo had learned in his final 3 days what happened when you tried to take any of them away. The story of Anthony Gallo's disappearance became one of the most whispered stories in New York's underworld. Not because anyone talked about it openly, nobody did. Even Gallo's own crew refused to discuss what had happened. But the story existed in the silence, in the way people avoided certain topics, in the way nobody ever blocked anyone from visiting graves at Woodlawn Cemetery again. Over the years, different versions emerged. Some said Bumpy had Anthony killed the same day, within that hour and 5 minutes between his first and second visit to the cemetery. Others claimed Anthony was still alive, living in hiding somewhere, too afraid to ever come back to New York. A few suggested that Anthony had been given a choice: leave and never return, or stay and be buried in the same cemetery where he'd committed his greatest mistake. Nobody knew for certain. But what everyone agreed on was this: Anthony Gallo had crossed a line that nobody crosses. He'd taken something sacred, something personal, something that had nothing to do with business or territory or power, and he tried to use it as leverage. And in doing so, he'd learned the oldest lesson in the underworld. You can challenge a man's money. You can challenge his territory. You can even challenge his reputation. But you don't touch what he holds sacred, because sacred things aren't negotiable. They're not strategic. They're not business. And when you violate them, the response isn't about sending messages or establishing dominance or winning conflicts. The response is about removal. Complete, permanent, irreversible removal. Anthony Gallo disappeared on November 5, 1959. His crew disbanded within a month. His territory was absorbed by other organizations. His name stopped appearing in police reports. And eventually, even the people who'd known him stopped mentioning him. Not because they forgot, because remembering what happened when Bumpy Johnson was blocked from visiting his father's grave was a lesson worth keeping silent about. Some stories teach by being told, others teach by never being told at all. November 2nd, 1968, 9 years later. Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack at Wells Restaurant in Harlem. His funeral was held at Abyssinian Baptist Church on November 8, 1968. 2,000 people attended. Afterward, the procession drove to Woodland Cemetery, where Bumpy was buried in Section 14, Plot 128, right next to his father. During the burial, nobody mentioned Anthony Gallo. Nobody referenced what had happened 9 years earlier, but everyone standing there, everyone who'd known Bumpy, everyone who'd understood how he'd lived, they all knew why that particular cemetery plot had remained empty for 9 years, waiting. Because Bumpy Johnson had always intended to be buried next to his father, and nobody was ever going to stop him from visiting that grave. Not in life, and certainly not in death. The white carnations Mame placed on both graves that day were the same type Bumpy brought every November 2nd for 34 years. She would continue bringing them every year until her own death in 2009. And during all those years, nobody ever blocked access to Section 14, Plot 127, and Plot 128, because everyone remembered what happened to the last person who tried. They remembered that he disappeared, and they remembered that some things, once they're made sacred, stay sacred forever, no matter what.